Dean Martin holds the invitation in his hands. January 14, 1961. Cream-colored envelope. Gold-embossed seal. The words every entertainer in America dreams of reading. The President of the United States requests the pleasure of your company. He feels the weight of the paper. The weight of what it means. This is the invitation. The one that opens every door. The one that proves you've made it. The one that says, you matter. Dean looks at the envelope for a long moment. Then he looks at the photograph on his mantle. Sammy and May. Their wedding day. November 13, 1960. The happiest Sammy has ever looked. The same Sammy who has just received a different kind of letter. Not an invitation. An uninvitation. A polite request to stay home. To be invisible. To pretend he doesn't exist. Because the President of the United States is afraid of what the South might think. Dean picks up the cream-colored envelope and tears it in half. What those two pieces of paper cost him no one would ever know. But what they bought him was something money couldn't touch. 6 days later, the most powerful man in the world would be sworn in as president, and Dean Martin's chair would be empty. To understand why Dean Martin tore up a presidential invitation, you have to understand America in 1960, and you have to understand what it cost to be Sammy Davis Jr. America 1960 was two countries pretending to be one. In the North they talked about equality, in the South they practiced segregation, and in Hollywood they smiled for the cameras while enforcing rules nobody wrote down but everybody understood. Sammy Davis Jr. broke every one of those rules. He was black, he was Jewish, he was talented beyond measure, and on November 13, 1960, he married May Britt, a blonde, blue-eyed Swedish actress. But Sammy had already made one sacrifice. He'd postponed his wedding, pushed it from October to after the election, because the Kennedy campaign was worried about Southern voters. He'd done that for Jack, and this was his reward. The hate mail arrived by the sackful, death threats, bomb threats, and then came the political cost. The word came down from Joseph Kennedy, the old man, not Jack himself, but in politics that distinction rarely mattered. Sammy was out. Margaret Sullivan had been Dean Martin's assistant for 7 years. She had never seen him angry, but when Dean read about Sammy being asked to skip the inauguration, the same inauguration for a president he had helped elect, Margaret watched something change in Dino's eyes. Not anger, something colder, disappointment. Dean knew what it felt like to be told you don't belong. In Steubenville, they called him Dago. They laughed at his accent. He remembered the sting. Sammy felt that every day, and now the Kennedys were making him feel it again. When Frank heard about Sammy, he went quiet. When Peter Lawford heard, he made excuses. But Dean didn't go quiet. He made a phone call. January 14, 1961, 11:47 p.m. The phone rang in Sammy Davis Jr.'s house. May answered. Her voice was tired. They'd been getting calls all week. Reporters, haters, people who wanted to remind them that America wasn't ready. It's Dean, the voice said. May handed the phone to Sammy without a word. I heard, Dean said. No greeting, no small talk. Sammy was quiet for a moment. It's politics, Dean. I understand. Jack's got to don't. The word hung in the air. Don't make excuses for him, Sammy. He asked you to disappear. After everything you did, after every stage you stood on, after every hand you shook, he asked you to disappear. Sammy didn't respond. What could he say? I got my invitation today. Dean continued. Dean, you should go. This is the president. This is history. I don't want you to too. I'm not going. Sammy sat down. His shoulders dropped. May watched him from the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes wet. Dean, listen to me. You can't do this. Not for me. I'm not doing it for you. Dean's voice was flat, final. I'm doing it because it's wrong. And I'm not going to stand in the snow and clap for a man who treats my brother like he's something to be ashamed of. The press will. Let them. Frank will. Frank can do what Frank wants. I'm doing what I want. There was a long silence. Sammy could hear Dean lighting a cigarette on the other end of the line. You're sure about this, pal? Sammy, I've never been more sure about anything. Your family, and family doesn't get left behind. Frank Sinatra called Dean the next morning. Are you out of your goddamn mind? Dean sipped his coffee. Good morning to you too, Frank. This is the president. This is Jack. I vouched for you. I got you that invitation. Then unvouch for me. Frank's jaw tightened. His voice dropped. Dangerous. Dean, you're making me look bad. No, Frank. Jack made himself look bad. I'm just not pretending it didn't happen. The line went dead. Frank hung up without saying goodbye. For 3 days, he didn't call back. Dean stood by his window that night. The California air was warm. Jasmine from the garden. The distant hum of traffic on Sunset. He looked at the torn invitation on his desk. 2 pieces of expensive paper. Worth nothing now. Worth everything. But on January 19th, the night before the inauguration, Frank Sinatra did something nobody expected. January 19, 1961, 9:23 p.m. Dean's phone rang again. It's Frank. Dean waited, his fingers curled around the receiver. "I'm not going to apologize," Frank said, "because I still think you're an idiot." "Noted. But I understand why you're doing it. And Frank paused. The great Frank Sinatra, struggling for words, his breath caught. "I wish I had the guts to do the same." Dean didn't respond. "Sammy's at home right now," Frank continued, sitting in his living room, watching the news coverage, all the arrivals, all the celebrities, all the people who are going to be there tomorrow, and he's sitting alone. He's not alone. May's with him. "You know what I mean, pal." Dean knew. "Go to him," Frank said. "Tonight. Sit with him. Watch the inauguration with him tomorrow. Let him know that someone chose him over all of this. That's the plan." "Good." Frank's voice cracked. "Just slightly. Tell him I'm sorry I'm not brave like you." January 20th, 1961. Inauguration Day. Dean Martin arrived at Sammy's house at 8 a.m. He brought donuts, coffee, a deck of cards. "What's this?" Sammy asked. His eye, the one he'd lost in that car accident years ago, glistened. "We're watching history, Pally. Might as well be comfortable." They sat on Sammy's couch, May curled up in the armchair, her lips pressed together, fighting tears. The television flickered. On screen, Washington, D.C., snow falling, crowds gathering, the most powerful people in the world, dressed in their finest, waiting to witness history. In Sammy's living room, 3 people, donuts, coffee, silence. At the inauguration, somewhere in the VIP section, there was an empty seat, the seat that should have held Dean Martin. Nobody commented on it, nobody asked questions, but Margaret Sullivan, watching from her apartment, noticed, and she smiled. Dean's hands didn't tremble, his spine didn't stiffen. He sat on that couch like it was the most natural place in the world, because for him it was. The ceremony began. JFK stepped to the podium. The oath was administered. "Ask not what your country can do for you." Sammy watched, his jaw tight, his knuckles whitened against the armrest. Dean glanced at his friend. "You okay?" Sammy shook his head. "I helped him, Dean. I stood on stages and told people to vote for him. I postponed my own wedding for him. And now I'm watching from my living room like I'm nobody." Dean put down his coffee, leaned forward. "Sammy, look at me." Sammy turned. "You're not nobody. You're my brother. And if my brother can't walk through that door, neither will I." Sammy's shoulders dropped. Something released in his chest. In Steubenville, Dean's father had taught him something. When they tell you that you don't belong, and you hold on to them, no matter what. Dino had held on to Sammy, through the segregation, through the hate mail, through the empty invitations. And today, on the day America celebrated its new beginning, Dean Martin was exactly where he belonged. On a couch, with his brother, eating donuts. 6 days. That's how long Dean had waited since tearing up that invitation. 6 days of phone calls from angry agents. 6 days of Frank's silence. 6 days of wondering if he'd made a mistake. But sitting here now, watching Sammy laugh at something May said, Dean knew the answer. Some things are worth more than invitations. The newspapers barely mentioned it. Dean Martin absent from inauguration, a small paragraph on page 6. No explanation. No controversy. But in the entertainment industry word traveled. Dean Martin had turned down the President of the United States for Sammy. Something changed in Sammy Davis Jr. after January 20th. The death threats didn't stop. The hate mail kept coming, but Sammy walked differently now. His shoulders were straighter. His smile reached his eyes. Before that day, May would say years later, Sammy questioned whether he belonged anywhere. After Dean showed up with those donuts, he never questioned it again. That's the thing about loyalty. You can't buy it. You can't fake it. You can only recognize it when someone tears up an invitation for you. Joseph Kennedy never mentioned Dean Martin's name again. The old man had a long memory for slights. But Jack Kennedy, the president himself, surprised everyone. 3 months after the inauguration, a package arrived at Dean's house. No return address. Inside was a photograph of the empty chair at the ceremony. On the back, in handwriting that looked rushed, "I understand, JFK." Dean never showed the photograph to anyone, but Margaret found it years later, tucked behind the letter from May, 2 pieces of paper that said more than any speech ever could. Frank Sinatra stood in the snow for 3 hours. He watched JFK take the oath. He attended the balls. He smiled for the cameras. But that night in his hotel room, he called Dean. "How was it?" Dean asked. "Cold. That's it?" Frank was quiet. "I kept looking at the empty seat. Your seat. And I kept thinking about Sammy's living room. And I was at the most important event in America, and I would rather have been eating donuts with you 2 idiots." 3 weeks later, Dean received a letter. No return address. Dear Dean, when Sammy came home that night after watching the inauguration with you, he was different. Not healed, not happy, but lighter, like someone had reminded him that he mattered. You did that. Thank you. For everything. May. And so Dean Martin missed the inauguration, missed the history, missed the photographs. The story could have ended here. A quiet act of loyalty, a friendship preserved. But history has a way of remembering what it wants to remember, and forgetting what it wants to forget. Margaret Sullivan retired in 1975. At a tribute dinner in 1988, someone asked her, what was Dean Martin really like? She thought for a moment. He was the man who brought donuts, the man who chose the couch over the ceremony, the man who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is sit with someone who feels alone. There's a photograph from 1990, Sammy's final television tribute. Sammy, thin and fragile, sitting in a chair, Frank on one side, Dean on the other. 3 old men, 3 friends, 3 survivors of an industry that had tried to break each of them in different ways. Look closely at that photograph. Look at where Dean's hand is, resting on Sammy's shoulder, the same shoulder he'd put his arm around in 1961, when the whole country was watching and judging. 30 years, that's how long that hand stayed there, through segregation, through civil rights, through assassinations and scandals and everything America threw at them. 30 years of donuts on couches. Sammy died 2 months later, May 16, 1990. Dean didn't attend the funeral. Couldn't. The thought of seeing that chair empty, the chair Sammy had sat in for 3 decades, was more than he could bear. He sent flowers instead, white roses, and a note that read, "Save me a seat, Pally." He stopped laughing. Dina Martin would say later, "After Sammy died, something in my father just went quiet." What Dean Martin did on January 20, 1961 didn't make the newspapers. It didn't change any laws. It didn't end segregation, but it changed what one man believed about himself. Sammy Davis Jr. spent the rest of his life knowing, really knowing, in his bones that he mattered, that someone had chosen him over history, over power, over everything the world said was important. That knowledge carried him through decades of discrimination, through cancer, through every moment when the world tried to tell him he wasn't enough. Because Dean Martin had torn up an invitation, and that small act echoed through 30 years of friendship. We all like to believe we'd make the hard choice, the unpopular choice, the choice that costs us something. But most of us find excuses. We tell ourselves it's complicated. We tell ourselves our friend would understand. Dean Martin didn't find excuses. He found donuts, and a couch, and a friend who needed him. We all want to be remembered for the big things, the achievements, the standing ovations. But the truth is simpler. The people who matter most are the ones who show up, who stay, who sit in the chair when sitting in the chair costs them something. We all have friends, people we laugh with, people we call when things are good. But how many of us have someone who would tear up an invitation to the White House? Someone who would choose a couch over history? That's the question Dean Martin answered on January 20th, 1961. Not with words, with donuts. January 20th, 4:47 p.m. The inauguration was over. History had been made. In Sammy's living room, the donuts were gone. The television was off. The California sun was setting over a country that still had so far to go. Dean stood up, grabbed his jacket. "Hey, Sammy? Yeah? Next time they invite you to the White House, you call me. We'll go together, or we won't go at all." Sammy laughed. The first real laugh in weeks. The kind of laugh that comes from knowing you're not alone. "Deal, Pally." Dean walked to his car, looked up at the California sky. No snow here, no history, no grand speeches about what we can do for our country. Just a friend, a couch, a day well spent. Ain't that a kick in the head? That was Dean Martin. Not the singer, not the movie star, not the man who made millions laugh on television. The man who brought donuts. The man who chose a couch over the ceremony. The man who understood that sometimes loyalty isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up when showing up costs you something. If you believe legends deserve to be remembered not just as icons, but as human beings, subscribe to this channel and hit that bell. Every week we step behind the curtain. We uncover the moments the spotlight never showed. The friendships, the heartbreaks, the quiet acts of courage that never made the headlines. This is Dean Martin, Untold Stories, and we're just getting started. Now I want to hear from you. Dean Martin tore up an invitation to the White House. He gave up a chance to stand next to the President of the United States. He risked his career, his reputation, everything, for a friend who was told he didn't belong. So here's my question. Would you do the same? Would you tear up that invitation for your best friend? Or would you go to the ceremony and tell yourself they'd understand? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one.